Olá, TUTAMÉIA está ao vivo, falando diretamente dos nossos estúdios domésticos com a Eleonora.
O Rodolfo.
E do outro lado da tela, conversa conosco hoje, desde Nova York, a jornalista Hoda Osman, que a Eleonora apresenta agora com mais detalhes e inicia, então, essa nossa entrevista de fim da tarde. Eleonora.
Hoda Osman, it's very nice to have you here at TUTAMÉIA. Today is the 10th of July of 2024. Eu vou falar em português a apresentação da Hoda Osman e, em seguida, a gente faz a entrevista em inglês. Hoda Osman é editora executiva da Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism e presidente da Associação de Jornalistas Árabes e do Oriente Médio. Ela passou por várias redações, baseada em Nova York, ela trabalhou na ABC News, na unidade de jornalismo investigativo da ABC News, da CBS News, foi correspondente da France 24 Horas, PBS, enfim, é uma lista enorme de publicações e mídia nas quais ela trabalhou, e eu vou começar perguntando para ela como é esse jornalista, que avaliação se tem sobre o trabalho jornalístico em Gaza nesse momento. Hoda, thank you so much. I would like to begin asking you what is to work with journalists in Gaza.
First, I want to thank you very much for having me on and for giving this very important subject, giving what's happening to the journalists in Gaza attention and giving it time. I was one of the journalists who worked on what we call the Gaza Project. This is a project that involved over 50 journalists from 13 news organizations, working specifically to investigate the killing of the journalists in Gaza by the Israeli military. The numbers are staggering. The number of journalists killed in Gaza since October 7th is over 100 journalists. There are different organizations that collect the information and do the calculations differently, but by the most conservative numbers, if we just look at the lowest numbers, they're still record-breaking. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 103 Palestinian journalists have been killed in this war. This is the largest number since CPJ started collecting and keeping records in 1992. It's also higher than the journalists who have been killed in World War II, which lasted 6 years, more than the journalists who've been killed in Vietnam War, and more than the journalists who've been killed in the Iraq War. These wars lasted years, and yet the number of journalists killed was less than the numbers we're seeing today. By the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate estimate, or by their record keeping, as of today, 152 Palestinian journalists have been killed. So what we set out to do as investigative journalists is we were finding that there wasn't the sort of outcry, the sort of reaction that lives up to the scale of this crisis. This is not a crisis for just Arab or Palestinian journalists, but the international journalism community. We were not seeing the sort of emergency mode that this crisis deserves. And as investigative journalists, we decided that the best we can do is do what we do best, which is report and investigate the killing of the journalists. And this is where the Gaza Project comes, Forbidden Stories, a nonprofit that is based in Paris and whose mission is to continue the work of journalists who've been silenced either because they've been killed, injured, or threatened, or censored. They were the organization that brought us all together to work on this important project.
So would you say that the journalists, the Palestinian journalists in Gaza, are actually being used as a target? I mean, the Israeli forces are targeting journalists and media outlets, and why would they do this?
So, as part of there are different ways to start answering this question. And actually, I'd like to start by the talking about the journalists themselves in Gaza. Every day, almost, since October 7th, I've been speaking to journalists in Gaza, and they are telling us that they believe they are being targeted, to the extent that many of them now fear reporting publicly. There are journalists I know who report without using their name because they worry that if their name is publicly known, that this could lead to them being targeted. There's one journalist we mentioned in our stories who is reporting from one of the hospitals, and he put his family in a separate place because he's worried that by being with them, he would risk their life. Many journalists tell us that they don't wear the vest anymore, or that if they're wearing the vest, people around them, if they want to take a taxi, if they want to rent an apartment, because of course everyone has been displaced, that people worry that by being close to a journalist, they're going to be targeted. So the starting point is that the journalists themselves, they do believe that they are being targeted. In addition to that, there have been several cases where targeting is clearly, there's high evidence or a lot of evidence that targeting has happened. For example, there is one, actually not Palestinian, but a Lebanese journalist, Assam Abdallah. He was a Reuters photojournalist, was killed on October 13th on the border between Israel and Lebanon. And there were multiple investigations showing that he was targeted. And there's actually a case in court with the International Criminal Court filed by Reporters Without Borders, and I believe maybe other organizations, for this particular case. Let me talk about the organizations for a minute to address this issue of whether the journalists are being targeted. There are, up until now, 3 cases involving 20 Palestinian journalists that have been filed by Reporters Without Borders, in which, in these cases, they believe there is enough evidence to show that there has been targeting of journalists. In addition to that, we look at the numbers. We see that if we just look at CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, if we just look at the numbers of CPJ, 103 journalists, most of them, over 80, have been killed in airstrikes. Over half were killed in their home. So there was a strike on their specific home, and most of those who were killed at home were also, family members were also killed in those airstrikes. In addition to that, if we look at the investigations that came out of this project that I'm talking about, there's one particular investigation that was done by Forbidden Stories, and it's about targeting of journalists by drones. Drones are considered to be highly accurate and sophisticated equipment. The journalist who did this report, Mariana, she spoke to numerous experts who told her that the drone is able to see if a journalist is wearing a press vest clearly marked with the press on it, the drone would be able to see this. Drones are constantly, if you speak to anyone in Gaza, in the background, you will hear a drone. The drones are constantly flying around, gathering information, and they're supposed to minimize the casualties among civilians. They're supposed to give information that would minimize the killing amongst journalists as civilians, and yet this report showed that there were 18 journalists targeted by drones, which are supposed to be highly accurate and highly sophisticated. In addition to that, I can cite several investigations that came out of this project, including, let me speak about one. There was an attack on the AFP offices in Gaza on November 2nd. An explosion caught on camera because there was a live camera set up in that office. And immediately afterwards, AFP, when I say AFP, I refer to Agence France Presse. It's the prestigious French news agency. AFP contacted the Israeli military asking for an explanation. Why was there an attack on the office? The Israeli army first denied that there was anything, then said there were clashes nearby, so this could be debris. But the damage was clearly much more than simply a result of debris or of clashes nearby. So one of our main investigations during the Gaza project was about this incident, because we had something to work with. We had the footage that was caught on camera when the attack happened. we were able to determine and find out by analyzing the footage through 2 independent visual forensic investigations, 1 audio investigation, as well as at least 6 experts, that the AFP offices were directly fired at by an Israeli tank that was 3 kilometers away. 4 times in a row, the same office was hit by the Israeli tank. In addition to that, we found out, because we had the live footage, we were able to find another attack just an hour, less than an hour before this attack on AFP's offices, another media office, another building, same street, 16th floor, this time a local company called PMG, the Palestinian Media Group. Their offices just an hour before was also hit with a tank shell. Unfortunately, this time, the AFP offices were empty because the staff had evacuated. Unfortunately, the PMG offices, they had 4 people in them, including 2 journalists, and one of the journalists was really badly hurt in his leg. So how can the Israeli military and Israel claim that this was not the thing that is in common between these 2 instances is that both offices had live cameras. So the claims, even after we, of course, before we published, we had to go back to the Israeli military and ask again for answers. And again, they denied that there was targeting of the office, even though we have irrefutable evidence that there was direct firing at these 2 offices. So the claims that at least when it comes to this particular incident, press infrastructure, media companies were directly targeted. So all this to say that the evidence comes from many different, whether it's the journalists talking, whether it's the organizations looking into specific cases and filing lawsuits, whether it's our own investigations that collectively show that, this cannot just be a result of the war, so journalists are being killed as a result of the war. There are some questions that need to be answered, at least when it comes to some of these cases. I feel like this was one of the main and important findings of our project.
A Hoda acabou de mostrar algumas das evidências que apontam que os jornalistas em Gaza, os jornalistas palestinos em Gaza, são alvos específicos dos ataques de Israel. Isso é um resultado de investigação que está disponível no projeto Gaza Project, e ela falou uma das coisas que ela falou foi do ataque específico ao prédio da France Press. But Hoda, once you have found, or found comprovation, proof that journalists were being specifically targeted, I wonder why. What are the reasons behind these attacks? Why journalists are being specifically attacked by the Israeli forces?
I think it's a question for Israel and the Israeli military. Why? And you can find the answer maybe even by not even just looking at Gaza, but looking at the history. One of the important reports that the Committee to Protect Journalists released, it was actually released a few months before the war started, is a report called Deadly Pattern. And they tracked 20 cases over 22 years of attacks against journalists who have not been investigated, or at least there were claims by the Israeli military and by the Israeli government that there were investigations. No one is ever brought to justice. No, there is no accountability. There is just impunity. And this is not, these are not my words. These are the words of the experts, the researchers who researched this and showed that there is a pattern. These are the words of also, we had an important interview with Irene Khan, who's the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and you can see some of the strong quotes that are mentioned in our stories. So, we could, the journalists themselves, if you ask them, like, for example, let me tell you, the story that I just mentioned about the Palestinian Media Group, we interviewed the CEO, and he told us it seems that the live camera bothers Israel, that the image bothers Israel.
And why is there a silence on this subject? We don't see this discussion about journalism and all these murders, all this genocide, also between journalists. Why the media do not? This subject does not exist for the great groups of media.
It was really, as I mentioned, one of the reasons why we decided to work on this project is that we're seeing a lot of watching and not a lot of acting. Why? I think it's a very complex question. And the Western media, there's lots of critique about the Western media and how it's been covering, the war in general. But when I can only speak about like the journalists right now. And when it comes to journalists, I think that this question needs to be asked of the organizations. Like since the war started, I've been to a number of conferences or award ceremonies, and it's often either not mentioned or it's barely mentioned. And like I said, this is a crisis for us as an international journalism community. How can we not recognize that this is happening to the journalists? And I don't want to answer this question on behalf of, the media or the organizations. I think that they need to take a deep look and examine why this is happening.
But what are the risks of this for the common people? I mean, there will be a lack of information for the people in general, no?
Absolutely, and thank you for this question, because it brings us to an important point that again is not addressed enough. No foreign journalists are allowed to enter Gaza, which means that the burden of reporting this war falls on the journalists who themselves are suffering and struggling like the civilians in Gaza themselves. One of the journalists told me, I report on people being hungry. I myself am hungry. They themselves have to find water. They themselves, actually, let me speak about something. We did a survey at ARIJ, Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, my organization. We did a survey of the journalists, and we had over 200 journalists respond. Almost all of them, 98%, were displaced. Many of them were displaced over 5 times. I think there were a few that were displaced over 20 times. Can you imagine in 9 months moving over 20 times and continuing to report? I think I have never seen such resilience amongst journalists, such courage to just continue working in spite of everything, day in and day out. They've lost a lot of family members and friends and colleagues. In our survey, we show how many family members have been lost. And collectively, the over 200 journalists that responded to the survey, they've lost 661 family members, including 11 who lost either one or more of their children. And this is not even, I'm talking about just 200. The estimates are that there are around 2,000 or over 2,000 journalists in Gaza. So why are foreign journalists not allowed? This is not to take away from how the quality of reporting that is being done by the Palestinian journalists. It is stellar, but having foreign journalists be in Gaza and report on this, not accompanying the army, because the army does take some journalists with it to report, but they go in with the army, and they have to, be restricted in where they can go and what they see. But doctors are being allowed into Gaza to help in the hospitals. Humanitarian workers are being allowed in. Why are the journalists not being allowed in to at least help a little bit with the reporting? Because what's happening now, over 100 journalists have been killed, many journalists injured. There are at least, according to the Palestinian journalist syndicates, over 50 journalists have been detained. We also, we need to speak about the detentions, have been detained. Journalists have decided to stop working because of the risks that they perceive could affect them and their families. Many journalists, especially the ones who are working for international media, have evacuated. So those who are left are really like have the responsibility to continue reporting. So for us to see what is going on over there, and they are exhausted. So I hope that there is enough pressure to push for foreign journalists to enter Gaza and to do some of the reporting there.
Is it possible to just form a kind of brigade of international journalists to go there and force the entrance? How do you think this can be organized?
I don't really, to be honest, like, you know, I'm a reporter myself, I'm a journalist myself. I don't know what sort of pressure would work. It seems that it needs to be high level, maybe coming from countries, because there were attempts to do so. And so far, it really hasn't worked. And I think because the war is so overwhelming in so many ways, there are, you know, the deaths continue every day, the images, the videos, there's negotiations. So there hasn't been enough focus on this. And I hope that in the coming period, we see more pressure coming from international organizations, from governments, to put pressure for journalists to enter Gaza and to start reporting from there.
You talked about journalists being imprisoned. Do you have any information, or did your group gather information about the conditions of these prisons?
We didn't do a story and investigation into this, but as part of our interviews, we did meet with one center in the occupied West Bank that works on detentions. I don't have the numbers with me right now, but we've been seeing the journalists who are coming out of, who are being released after being detained, the condition that they come out in, also their testimony about the treatment inside. The Committee to Protect Journalists did an interview with one of these journalists, and the testimony is just horrifying. The torture and the mistreatment of the journalist during the detention is quite disturbing.
And how about censorship? Do you have any investigation about the censorship in the news media, in the media companies about this war?
So the Gaza Project focused on Gaza and mostly on the killings. So we didn't really work on censorship either within Israel itself, but 972 was part of the project, and they've been doing some work about this. 972 magazine have been doing some work about this, but separate from the Gaza Project itself.
And what can you tell us about how the Palestinian journalists work? How they can send the image, send some reports, access the internet? I mean, this is. I imagine that this would also be a heroic action, no?
It is really heroic. It's a nightmare for them over there. I'm amazed. You know, so we interviewed over 50 sources, including many journalists, because this is a story about journalists. So many of the sources were actually working journalists over the course of the 4 months, and there's just like they figure out ways. A lot of them use eSIMs, electronic SIMs, for their phones. They have to go to specific areas where they can get coverage so that they can send their material. They write on their phones. So many of them are actually write full reports. They don't have a laptop. Many of the journalists in our survey, almost 50% had lost the equipment that they use to report, whether it's a phone or a laptop. Many of the journalists now, they film using their phone, not their camera. Some of them say this is for security, because if I have a camera, it's more noticeable and I could be targeted. Some of them it's because they don't have a camera anymore and that's what they have, so that's what they use. And if you see some of the quality of some of the reporting that's been done with a phone, some of the journalists, they would send me the reports that they've done using the phone, and it's quite, it's really good quality. Given everything that is going on, I'm amazed by the quality of the reporting that is coming out of there. And they have to do this while trying to find water, trying to find a bathroom, to use. Like one of the journalists was telling me that they stand in line for hours to be able to use the bathroom. So they choose, even if they do find water, not to drink a lot of water so they wouldn't have to go to the bathroom, so that they can keep working for longer hours. So it's really quite disastrous, the conditions over there. And the creative and inventive ways that they continue to report in spite of all of this is just beyond, we have to admire it and we have to respect it.
There is no situation in history you can compare. It's an incomparable situation in history.
Absolutely, I agree. Absolutely.
And about all this work that the journalists do, how does it actually finds the public? I mean, it gets published in media, mainstream media, or just their social media? Is it actually the information is actually going to the public or to the world public, or it's just very restricted area?
Thank you. This is such an important question. I think what the war in Gaza has done is it sort of changed the way that we think about how we report, what journalism is, and how do we absorb information. So some of the journalists are using their social media as a main way to communicate and to report on what is happening. And whereas in the past, maybe this was considered, oh, it's not, journalism. Right now, there are some of the journalists, like one of the very famous journalists who was in Gaza and evacuated back in January is Mu'taz Azaiza. And he has 18 million followers. And he was taking raw pictures and videos and putting them on his social media, and people were seeing them. So it's a more, if we speak about the social media, it's more raw as far as like, this is what's happening, I'm showing it to you, and people are getting it unfiltered, sort of, without the journalist interfering in how it's presented or commenting on it much. And then there's all different, many of the journalists who work for international media were evacuated, but yet the international media, just like us, like our consortium for the Gaza project, it included us, Forbidden Stories in Paris, Paper Trail Media in Germany, The Guardian in the UK, Le Monde in France, 972. So we were also able to connect with journalists over there and still report on Gaza in spite of the blackout and the communication problems. We just have to be patient. So you can't expect to work the same pace that you would work on a regular story. You're going to send someone a message, maybe they'll respond in a week. Maybe they respond right away. Depends on where they are and what is going on. Some of the journalists work for local media, as you said, but also, many of them are reporting for media outside. But when we say mainstream media, if you mean mainstream media in Western countries, I don't think we're seeing that. We're seeing them being interviewed. We're seeing their pictures being used sometimes. But even recently, if you look at the mainstream media in the Western countries, the coverage of what's happening in Gaza has declined in terms of, where you see the story, or in generally speaking, you're not seeing as much coverage as you used
to. And how does the reporting done by the Palestinian journalists compares to what actually appears, say, on New York Times or Washington Post or CNN or Fox?
If I understand the question correctly, I don't think you can. I don't think we can make a comparisons. It's not, these American media organizations are doing their own reporting. They're interviewing sources there, and they're writing their stories. And the Palestinian journalist, if it's a report by the journalist themselves, him or herself, then it's going to mostly appear somewhere else. I haven't seen a lot of bylines by Gazan reporters now, after like many have been evacuated. in the Western media, but they're used as sources. Their photos are being used, their videos are being used, and there are some freelancers who may be working with this international media, but not as like a main correspondent. For example, like CNN would have a correspondent in a particular capital. That does not exist in Gaza. Also, it has to do, I have to also make this point, it has to do sometimes with the organization's own, they have a certain like risk assessments and restrictions that they have to ensure safety of the people who work with them on a full-time, or if they are staff. And this can't be guaranteed, of course, with Gaza, with what is happening. Because this has affected also the ability of some of the news organizations to hire staff out of Gaza.
And despite all of this, is it correct to say that Israel is losing this battle, the communication battle?
It's an analysis, to be honest, that I can't make. It's more of a political analysis. I've been very focused on just my work as a journalist. I just see what's happening to journalism as far as social media being a big part of the reporting, as a critical maybe turning point for this to be included, and for younger people. I see young people around me, and most of them don't read the so-called mainstream media, but like turn towards social media to get their news from there. So if I can comment at all about this question, I would say that the younger generations are definitely more drawn towards the social media in whatever form. It doesn't have to be the social media of the Palestinian journalists that's coming there. Maybe it's different social media, but I mean, they're drawn to that versus like reading a full report in one of the major newspapers.
What can you tell us about the information in the Gaza Strip? How the Palestinians are being informed about what's going on? They actually look at the social media. How they get informed?
So, of course, social media plays a big part, but also keep in mind that they have to, pay attention to how much, if they have a SIM card, how much are they using, how much are they downloading. So they often don't see as much as people outside are able to see. There was one journalist who was telling me that she had a limit every day of how much she can use the phone. And some of them, they've been separated even within Gaza. So some journalists are in the south and the middle, and their families are in the north. And some of them were telling me that to make sure that their families were okay, they would actually call someone outside of Gaza, and this person would call the family member in the north of Gaza, and that's how they would like get information about their own family. So, but they are connected. They are well informed, but the restrictions because of the communications and the SIM cards and all this is affecting, of course, all of this.
Hoda, at this point, I'll just bring some of the numbers of the genocide in Gaza, numbers of today, and I'll just ask you to comment after. A gente está aqui falando sobre o ataque das forças de Israel aos jornalistas palestinos, mas enfim, o genocídio continua. Eu queria só trazer aqui os números distribuídos hoje pelo Ministério da Saúde da Palestina, dando conta que já são 38.295 pessoas mortas pelas forças de Israel, sendo quase 7.779 crianças, 5.466 mulheres e idosos, 2.418. Outras fontes já trazem números maiores. Ora, you worked in a series of stories in the Gaza project. I wonder, first, would you like to comment about the numbers, these great numbers that show that this is a war, like President Lula said more than once, this is a war against women and children?
Of course, the numbers are, I don't even have words to comment on how horrible the numbers are. We focus a lot on the journalists, but when we take a step back and look at the overall numbers, it's just devastating. And of course, they're all not just numbers, and because of our work, we know that we've spoken to people who have lost, whose family members are one of those numbers you just showed. I've personally spoken to people who have lost a lot of family and friends. So yeah, it's and the sad thing is that it is continuing, whether when it comes to the in general the casualty numbers, just like every day regularly climbing, or when it comes to the journalists, like we did our report, and after we published, 5 journalists have been killed since then. Yeah, no words really.
And I would like to come back to the Gaza project. You specifically worked in some of the stories there. I would like to know what character or what story made you shiver, or was of more impact for you?
Press House. One of the stories we did was about this nonprofit organization, a prominent nonprofit organization called Press House. It was a journalism organization that's focus was to raise the capacity of journalists in Gaza, to advocate for freedom of expression, to make sure the journalists have what they need in emergencies as far as the press gear, to give them everything that they needed, to provide them with a second home. Many of the journalists describe it as their second home. It was a workspace, whatever they needed, internet, they needed power, they would go there and work there, including right after October 7th. Press House gave out to 84 journalists after October 7th the press vests and the helmets. Many of the ones that you see on TV, or unfortunately, sadly, in the funerals, are actually Press House vests and helmets. The story of Press House is really the story of journalists in Palestine. And it's one of the stories that I worked on. It was published in The Guardian. Talks about the loss of Press House and its meaning for the journalists in Gaza. 3 of Press House's members were killed within a period of 2 weeks. Just to give you an idea, right after the war started, October 7th, a lot of the journalists just went to Press House, and they were there and they were reporting from there and they got their press gear. And then on October 13th, Israel ordered the evacuation of people from the north to go to the south. So many of the journalists left, except for 3 journalists. Some journalists stayed, including 3 journalists from Press House, the founder, Bilal Jadallah, who's considered by so many as a father figure for journalists in Gaza, and 2 others. And then between November 6th and November 19th, all 3 of them were killed. On November 6th, the first one, Mohammed al-Jaja, was killed in his home with his family, 2 daughters and his wife. They were killed. On November 13th, Ahmed Fatima, the second one, was killed when the house that he was staying in, it was his in-laws' house, missiles struck the house. His son got injured, so he took his son and ran outside to get him medical help, and then he was killed with a drone. And then on October 19th, Bilal Jadallah, who up until then had refused to leave Gaza City because he wanted to stay and he wanted Press House to be open for the journalists, his family had left, finally decided that he was going to leave and go join his family in Khan Yunis. And he decided to take a safe route. We show this in our report. Israel would tell people which were the safe streets that they can use to go south. And it's marked in yellow. And he decided to take this route. He was in the car with his brother-in-law, and Bilal Jadallah was killed. And that day, November 19th, is just a loss for Palestinian journalists. I remember on that day speaking to some of the journalists, and just their voice and the devastation, they could not believe that Bilal Jadallah was gone. So this story just really, I feel embodies just the Palestinian journalists and what has happened to them. After Bilal Jadallah was killed, the building itself, Press House, was funded by the Norwegian and Swiss governments. And as a regular practice, the foreign organizations or foreign governments would communicate with the Israeli army and give the army the map, location, and coordinates for their buildings. So these coordinates were given to the Israeli military several times in the past and also after October 7th. And yet, after Bilal Jadallah was killed, we interviewed one eyewitness who was a friend of Bilal Jadallah. He also previously worked in Press House. And when this person couldn't find anywhere to stay because his house was also under siege, he decided to go with his family and stay in Press House. While he's there, a tank came, stood in front of the building, and fired directly at the building. Thankfully, the man and his family managed to leave the following day. And after he left, the building was completely demolished. So again, an attack, a targeting of a press building, but also just like the collective loss. I mean, the building, you can build buildings back, but how can you bring back Bilal Jadallah and the others who have been killed? To kind of end the story on a somewhat positive note, we spoke with the current acting director of Press House, and he told us that in honor and in memory of Bilal Jadallah, they plan to work on bringing Press House back, and when the war ends, to go back for Press House to play this role that it played before.
What can change in journalism after this genocide, after this war? What lessons journalists can learn about all of this story we are talking to us? What can be changed in journalism? What will be the journalists after this genocide?
I think a lot has changed already. I think what we've been taught in journalism schools and by journalism so-called like icons has been shattered. When it comes to many things, ethics, like you're taught to distance yourself from the events you are covering. How do you do that when you are the only, when there are no journalists but the journalists who are suffering from what they are covering? So this is one thing that has changed. Safety, journalist safety and protection. We go to these workshops and we're taught you have to do this, you have to, whether it's physical or whether it's, but it has all been like there's nothing that the journalists can do to be safe. They worry about wearing the press vest that they are taught you should wear it to protect you because they think they will be killed. And finally, social media. I mean, getting this raw and unfiltered account and pictures and videos of what is happening, we cannot discount it. We can't say that it's going to go back to purely being reading a report in the order that the reporter has decided, with the interviews that the reporter decided to make, and that this is going to be the only information I'm getting about something that's happening. It's definitely become an integral part of understanding the nuances and complexities of events, whatever the events are, whether they are war or not, is to try and also see who is doing what on social media and what is some of the raw footage that is coming out of there.
You and your group, the journalists and the organizations that work with the Gaza project, intended to show what's going on, what's happening with journalists in Gaza. I wonder, what do you think could be done? What more could be done, say, by journalist unions in states, in other countries, or international journalist organizations? Do you think they are working with the Gaza journalists in mind? do you think more can be done?
For sure, more can be done. I think to start with, just a recognition of the scale of what is happening. I haven't seen enough recognition. And then organizations should do what organizations do. I don't like work in these organizations. I don't know how they usually like put pressure or operate, but they need to advocate for the journalists. They need to advocate for journalist safety. They need to advocate for free flow of information, for unblocking journalists from entering and reporting out of Gaza. I can't like, you know, I can't tell them how to do this, but it needs to be done. But like to start with, the journalists in Gaza feel forgotten. They feel neglected. To start with, just to recognize this is an unprecedented event for journalists and for journalism, and let's rise up to, you know, the scale of what is happening. As far as I'm a journalist, I'm not an activist. I'm not even an activist for journalists. You know, I do what I do best, which is what we did with the Gaza project, and I hope we will continue doing. We're going to continue investigating the killings, the injury, the detention of the journalists, and I hope by just informing and reporting that we are doing our part for our colleagues.
Great, Hoda. We'd like to thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, bringing so many lessons about journalism and humanity. A Hoda Osman, como falamos antes, ela atua nesse projeto chamado Gaza Project, que mostra a situação, o que está acontecendo com os jornalistas na faixa de Gaza. É fácil achar, é um projeto construído por várias organizações de mídia. Uma delas é a entidade da qual a Hoda é diretora, que é a Associação dos Jornalistas Árabes, a Associação dos Repórteres Árabes para Jornalismo Investigativo, ARIJ, se não me engano, a sigla, se você pesquisar com isso, ARIJ e Gaza Project, vai encontrar esse material. A gente agradece também a participação do público, que acompanhou aqui ao vivo e que fica conosco pela internet afora. Lembramos que essa entrevista fica disponível em todos os canais TUTAMÉIA, é só buscar por TUTAMÉIA TV e você nos encontra nas várias plataformas de podcast, no Twitter, no Facebook, no YouTube. No YouTube, não deixe de se inscrever no nosso canal e clicar na sinetinha para receber avisos de novos vídeos. Visite também o nosso site, TUTAMÉIA, o endereço é tutameia.jor.br. E agora, então, vamos voltar com a palavra para a nossa convidada, para que ela mande sua mensagem para o nosso povo que está aqui conosco. Hoda, again, thank you very much. We'd like now, that this time with no questions, but to have your message for the Brazilian public.
And for the journalists
in Brazil. For the journalists in Brazil.
Well, first I have to thank you because I got an invitation to speak on a Brazilian show to Brazilian people. I feel like, you know, honored to be on your show and for you to give the attention and the time. This was a lengthy and deep discussion to this subject. Just like, you know, all the respect and appreciation to you. I would like to thank everyone who's watched this and who's interested in this subject. And to the Brazilian journalists, I say, please, you know, keep reading and finding out what's happening to the journalists in Gaza and also in the West Bank, and all the respect and you know, all the appreciation to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye
bye.
Bye bye.
Tchau, pessoal.
Tchau, tchau.
Thank you.